everyone. Thanks for coming out on this wet, cold, gross evening. I'm Sydney Buffkin, Mellon Digital Humanities Fellow, and the person responsible for at least half of the million emails you've been receiving. Welcome to the keynote event for Rewriting the Code, Women and Technology. We're really excited to see everyone and to be having these events, which we've been working on since the summer. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank the many, many people who helped make tonight and tomorrow happen. This forum really is an it takes a village situation, and we've received support from all over campus and beyond. The Class of 1963 Lecture Fund, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the University Lecture Funds, the Digital Humanities Cohort, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, the Dean of the College, the Dean of the Williams School, the Department of History, the Department of Computer Science, the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications, and the University Library. So thanks to all of those folks for their generous support. Mackenzie Brooks, Sarah Sprinkle, and Tony Losi have provided invaluable input as we conceptualize these events. And Jamie Kirikos has been essential in offering logistical support for the many logistics. Finally, Kelly Hara, the Mellon Digital Humanities Post-Baccalaureate Fellow, has put in so much work and come up with so many great ideas for these events. This weekend literally would not have happened without her. I certainly would not have made it through the planning with my sanity intact had it not been for Kelly's fantastic contribution and superhuman ability to get things done. So thanks to Kelly. And thanks to everyone who's had a hand in these great events. It's so awesome to have so many women getting together to talk about technology and history and communications and all the interesting careers that are out there. We're going to be continuing the conversation tomorrow with a series of fantastic panels. I'll say a bit more about that at the end of the evening, but I do want to take a quick minute to introduce our amazing speakers for tomorrow's panel discussions, and I will sort of point in the general direction, hopefully successfully, of everyone. So Sydney Bowles, a digital and radio journalist for WMMT and the Ohio Valley Resource, based in Eastern Kentucky. Logan Jaffe, engagement reporter for ProPublica Illinois. Stephanie Stelter, it's alphabetical, so Stephanie Stelter comes first. She's a WNL alumna and Associate Director of Technology and Operations for the Coalition for College. Stephanie Stillo, curator of the Lessing J. Rosenwald Graphic Arts Collection in the Rare Books and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress, and a former Mellon Fellow at WNL. And Diana Williams, digital editor and strategist for Backstory, the American History podcast. So even those brief introductions should give you a sense of what an awesome group of speakers we have here. And we hope you'll join us tomorrow in Hillel for those conversations. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Chelsea Barabas, who's a research scientist at MIT and the former head of social innovation at the MIT Media Lab's Digital Currency Initiative. Chelsea's done so much cool stuff that I'm not sure where to start or whether I have time to mention it at all. Her graduate work, which she completed at MIT, focused on the use of emerging technologies to serve the public good. Much of that work involved examining efforts by the United States tech industry to develop a diverse workforce and the biases and limitations inherent in the industry's recruitment practices. She's written widely about the limitations of algorithmic decision-making and hiring, and has also offered suggestions for more productive ways to expand minority representation in Silicon Valley. That focus on algorithmic bias extends to Chelsea's research on criminal justice, which warns that algorithmic predictions of risk among criminal offenders tend to reproduce racial biases and fail to productively evaluate the effects of different criminal justice interventions. At the Media Lab's Digital Currency Initiative, Chelsea examined the implications of cryptocurrency and decentralization on everything from healthcare to Bitcoin in Africa to the possibility of decentralized social networks, which unfortunately Chelsea and her collaborators say are a pipe dream. Chelsea's also made stuff, most notably the People's Bot, a friendly telepresence robot that allows people to attend events where they can't be physically present. All of this cool research has been covered in places like The Atlantic, Wired, Motherboard, Newsweek, the Boston Globe, and CBC. I'm super excited that Chelsea's here. Can't wait to hear what she has to say. So please join me in welcoming Chelsea Barabas.
Thank you guys. Can you hear me okay? I can't tell if this microphone is actually on, but the room isn't huge, so. Thank you so much, Sydney, for that introduction. I don't know where you found all that information. It is not all on my website, but, it gives a good background, I think, for some of the things I'm going to talk to you today about. As Sydney mentioned, I've spent, I guess, the last 5 or 6 years really being interested in kind of not only how we design technologies to address specific types of social problems, but also just how we think about that as a public. And specifically the role that technology plays in our imagination about how we can make the world a better place. So I'd just love to get a sense of who's in the room. I'm just curious, how many people here would consider themselves computer scientists or people who know how to code? Okay, cool. How many people here study the humanities or are humanists of one sort or another? Great, awesome. What about social science people, sociologists, anthropologists, cool. Basic scientists, chemists, biologists, anybody? Okay, cool. I was just curious because when I was preparing for this talk, I was super excited to see that so much of these the work that you guys are doing is really explicitly at this intersection of the humanities and technology. And I think that's really important, not only just because I think there's so much potential for technology to open up new ways for us to engage with the humanities, but also because I think the humanities really have a lot to offer for technologists in thinking about how they go about doing their work. So I come to you today as somebody who's been studying the social implications of technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence for the last few years. But my background is primarily in sociology and critical media studies. I have a feminist studies minor, Arabic and African literatures minor, so very much trained in the School of Humanities. And those experiences have given me a perspective that I think enables me to offer unique contributions to conversations about the near-term implications of cutting-edge tech that makes the headlines in various ways. So what I'd like to do today is kind of share with you some of my experiences and some of the things I've learned in doing that work. And I mentioned my own background because I do think oftentimes we're told that, the main way that you can really engage with technology and the workforce of the future is really just to know how to code. And software engineering is often held up as one of the key skill sets that we need in order to make the world a better place. Engineers and computer scientists specifically have taken on an increasingly dominant role in the academy, as well as kind of popular discourse in terms of kind of thinking about how we might address some of the world's most complex and trenchant social problems. So I've got up here, a tweet, a call for applications from the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, which is looking to hire data scientists and engineers to build tools to tackle problems in criminal justice, education, voting rights, and beyond, right? So clearly, computer science and engineering is seen as this very versatile skill set that can cut across all of these really interesting domains. Also, there's this really clear and explicit link between the idea of new technologies like artificial intelligence and social good specifically. And my institute, MIT, is a big part of this. Just over these, starting from yesterday, we're inaugurating a new school of computing with a big wad of cash. $1 billion has been given to MIT. And this College of Computing is actually supposed to have tentacles into every other department within the institute. So it's kind of seen as this umbrella set of skills that can cut across all of these different disciplines in these different ways, which I think is really interesting. At the same time, though, we're living in a time when this idea of the role of technology in social change is also being challenged in really interesting ways. MIT, I think, being a really interesting example of this. These are headlines from yesterday. So, as I mentioned, we are kicking off this new College of Computing. Henry Kissinger was invited to come speak to kind of inaugurate the school. And there are protests as a result of a lot of interesting kind of and uncomfortable entanglements between the financial elite, the tech elite, and academia that are starting to emerge. And so I think, it raises these really important questions about how do we understand the role of technology in social change. And I think I can hopefully walk us through a couple of case studies that I found really interesting as we start to think about this question. So as Sydney mentioned, I first got interested in the intersection of these kind of issues about 5 or 6 years ago as a graduate student, during a time when the tech sector was starting to face a lot of interesting pressure around the diversity of their tech workforce. So companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft were all being pressured to release statistics about what their workforce looked like, and specifically their technical workforce. These are the numbers that Google released finally in January of 2014. And it showed just how pale and male their workforce is. Over 80% male, over about 60% white, with the next big chunk being Asian. So two major racial categories making up over 90% of the workforce. So as everybody started to kind of take a closer look at this, the prevailing theory at the time was that the reason we had such a homogenous workforce was really that there just weren't enough skilled, diverse workers to actually hire. So this was essentially an issue of an educational pipeline gap. So as a result, we saw a lot of big tech companies start to invest a lot of effort and money in trying to strengthen that educational pipeline. Now, as a sociologist and a graduate student at the time, I was a little skeptical of this because this seemed a little too easy. This seemed like, oh man, this is not our fault. This is a deficiency in the potential population of people we could perhaps hire in the future. So I wanted to dig into the numbers a little bit more to understand this problem from a few other angles. And what I found was that actually it seemed like, while yes, there were some gaps earlier on in the pipeline, also tech had some pretty serious issues when it came to hiring and recruitment and retention. So here are just a couple of the stats I found. One being that unemployment rates for Black and Native American engineering grads, like folks who had the skills that were needed, was double that of their peers. And on top of that, women who made up almost 40% of the STEM degrees that were out there were only employed in STEM degrees about 15% of the time. And that was a rate that was about half that of their male counterparts. Really, and this one was really interesting because this really seemed to be an issue of retention. So this seemed to be an issue of hiring and recruitment. This was an issue of women coming in and then quickly leaving after about 3 to 5 years. So what I decided to do was to go to Silicon Valley as a sociologist and go start talking to CEOs and founders of tech companies to really get their perspective on what was going on. And what I found was that many tech leaders were resistant to this idea that they might be systematically overlooking people in the workforce. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was them saying, hey, listen, we are trying. Like, we want to grow our company faster than we can find talent right now. And you could see that. There was a lot of really aggressive poaching of people from competitor companies and this very small pool of people that were being tapped over and over for job offers. But even more interesting to me was that there seemed to be a cultural resistance to the idea that there might be gaps or flaws or biases in the way that people conceived of talent, particularly because there was this underdog mentality within tech that enabled them to see themselves as uniquely meritocratic amongst all the other industries that are out there. And I think that's well reflected in this quote from an interview I did with one CEO. Who said, what sets us apart from the douchebag tech people, or what sets apart the douchebag tech people from the douchebag Wall Street people, is that the douchebag Wall Street people fully accept their privilege and advantage. But the nerds still have this mindset of, I was the lower class person in high school, therefore, how can I possibly be accused of bullying someone now? If I can do it, anyone can. So I think this quote nicely captures this idea that, man, coding is one of those things anybody can learn on the internet, and we really want to find more skilled people, so if they're there, we're going to hire them, So amidst this backdrop, a really interesting set of companies started to emerge from within Silicon Valley who specifically were trying to build products to address tech's diversity problem. And these were companies like Intello, TalentBin, Guild, who basically were wanting to build these giant databases of all of the software engineers that made themselves known on the internet. So they would go to all these places like Stack Overflow, GitHub, And they scraped all of this information to try to basically get as comprehensive of a database as possible of anybody who knew how to code in any way. And then what they would do is they would develop an algorithm on top of that database to develop a recommendation system. So it's a search engine that would help different recruiters of tech companies be able to surface job candidates with different types of skill sets. And what was interesting with these companies is the way they sold their product was it was a solution to an information processing issue. You know, founders and CEOs of tech companies have some blind spots in the way you're doing hiring recruiting. We can help you more efficiently and accurately identify talent where you're not already looking. But even more interesting to me was that there was a specific narrative around social good that was also a part of this brand. So not only were we going to help you find talent accurately and efficiently, but we're going to help you find people who you're currently overlooking. We're going to help you find people who are diamonds in the rough. And I think that's reflected in some of this advertising material from one of the companies I work with that I'm going to call Talent AI. That's not their real name. But as you'll see, they had these pamphlets around you know, unintentional bias in hiring, and really tried to, you know, talk about how you could move beyond the really common proxies for talent, like, you know, which university you went to, and find people who more objectively like reflected the skills that you were really looking for. This is really interesting to me because this brand very much aligned with this idea that technology could help us achieve a more fair and meritocratic society moving forward. So what I wanted to do was embed myself with a couple of these different data science teams to really kind of see how the sausage was made. How were these algorithms developed? And what ended up fueling the recommendations that these platforms ended up making down the line? So for me, what I was particularly interested in was how do we end up making a measure stick to evaluate talent using these algorithmic systems? And who ended up being visible and who remained invisible under this algorithmic gaze? What I found was in many of these algorithms, most of the time, the factors that ended up being the most relevant were actually the same proxies that recruiters had used when making their hiring and recruitment decisions. So the things that ended up really mattering were things like which university you went to. Did you go to a name brand place like Stanford or MIT or Carnegie Mellon? Or your professional pedigree. Did you go work at Microsoft or Facebook or Google? And in many ways, this makes sense because the algorithms were training on data that was generated by the recruiters themselves. So, I mean, the data crumbs that were there were just reflective of the types of decisions that people had made in the past. And many of these platforms knew this. So they were also really interested in thinking about finding some sort of secret sauce ingredient or factor that might set them apart from some of their competitors. So they were looking for factors that might not be as intuitive signals of talent down the line. But these actually ended up being worse than these other factors I was talking about. They ended up being things like, one of the companies had found that good CTOs who ended up staying a long time in tech companies tended to list Lord of the Rings as one of their favorite books on Facebook. They're like, this is amazing, you know? Like, just if you close your eyes and imagine you're like your friend who's that Lord of the Rings fanatic, like, at least for me, that person looks a very specific way. Like, and it's a way that, like, I tend to think stereotypically CTOs of tech companies do look. So again, what we ended up seeing was kind of a reinforcement of the practices that had come before, but behind this kind of veer of scientific objectivity and neutrality that I think can be rather dangerous. What I learned from doing this work was that artificial intelligence is very much like a child. It tends to absorb the default assumptions of how the world works unless we teach it otherwise. But so often we sell technologies like AI as these scientific and objective tools that are free of the bias that we had in the past. And I think ultimately this runs the risk of masking the discriminatory practices of our past selves behind this veneer of scientific objectivity. So at its worst, I think these technologies could run the risk of legitimizing the worldview of the people who built it, and thus maintain the status quo. These tech companies didn't actually have to change much of their default logics and operational kind of MOs, but they did manage to find a way to justify the way they did their work through these algorithmic tools. What I think is encouraging, though, is I do think there's a growing awareness around these issues, particularly with predictive tools that use artificial intelligence and algorithms. Even just last year, Amazon pulled off the shelves kind of one of its in-house hiring and recruitment tools it had been using for a number of years, because they found that that tool was systematically degrading resumes that seemed to be coming from women. So if your resume had the word woman in it, tick off, you're no longer considered a good candidate. If you'd listed 2 or more all women's colleges, also was systematically downgraded. So Amazon tried to fix this internally, kind of quietly, before they decided to disband the project altogether. But what they found was it was actually quite tough to figure out how to intervene in these systems to address these issues. They didn't know why it was spitting out the results it was. So as a result, what they had to do was just call it off completely after a number of months of trying to address it. So what I've learned from doing that work is that technology really does inherit the beliefs and the blind spots of the people who create them. And that by increasing the diversity of the tech sector, we can actually expand the set of lived experiences that are reflected in the technologies that we build. And we can reduce the number of blind spots that those technologies end up having. And somebody who I draw a lot of inspiration from around this work, and I think illustrates this really well, is one of my colleagues from MIT, Joy Buolamwini. So Joy is currently a PhD candidate at the Media Lab, but a few years ago she was a master's student. And as a master's student, she was working on an art project that required facial recognition technology. So she was writing this code, trying to make this art project, and as she was doing the work, she realized the facial recognition software couldn't register her face as a human face. So she tried it on a few of her other friends, some of her lighter-skinned friends, and realized, oh wow, it can see my white friend's face, but it cannot see my face. So unless she wore this white mask right here. So she actually ended up pivoting her project to be around this idea of the coded gaze and trying to understand what do algorithms see and what do they not see. And she's gone on to do these amazing studies that expose a number of facial recognition platforms that actually systematically perform worse on darker female faces than they do on lighter male faces. And the reason being that the data sets that are used to train facial recognition software are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. And due to that lack of representation in the data set, the accuracy of the algorithm significantly decreases with different types of faces. She's doing a lot of really important work now to kind of surface these issues of visibility and invisibility in these systems. So I think the case of Joy's work really illustrates the importance of diversity in who builds our technologies, because it helps us identify these kinds of blind spots. But I think it's also important for us to not only think about expanding the diversity of who are the tech builders, but also who are the people we build for. Because I think target users are also really influential in determining what types of features and values are embedded in the tech that we build. So going back to the case of these hiring and recruitment algorithms, what I found there is many tech platforms, these recruitment platforms, were trying to develop some sort of score for competency so that a recruiter could put in, oh, I'm looking for somebody who can code in Python and gauge their competence in those skills. What I wasn't expecting was that also many of these platforms developed what they called a demand score. So what a demand score was designed to do was actually to help a recruiter not figure out whether or not you're competent, but figure out how in demand you were by other tech companies in the area. And the reason recruiters were interested in this was because they were rewarded for finding top talent at bottom rates. So their ideal in turning these knobs would be to find a highly competent person who was in low demand. Low demand people tended to be non-traditional candidates, people from community colleges, people who had worked as contract gig laborers in the past. And so what we found was that, by solving a problem for one group, these recruiters, these technologists were actually exacerbating problems for another group of people, which were these job candidates who were looking for jobs on the market. So this case study for me really helped me think about, what role does technology play in either maintaining or disrupting the way power and opportunity is distributed in our society? In the case of these recruitment algorithms, what I found was that the job candidates were really the product. They were in the database, and they were a part of the product offering for the customer, who were the companies. And this fed into a very particular power dynamic that's tended to serve the interests of employers while creating new challenges for job candidates. So just to recap the main lessons I learned from here, one was that tech can often serve as this powerful force of legitimation. It can give a particular worldview, such as the worldview of the recruiters of tech companies, a new kind of legitimacy by being instantiated and kind of codified into these seemingly objective and neutral algorithmic systems. And that also these systems give particular advantages through the form of information asymmetry, through being able to give visibility and insight for some, while exacerbating kind of those same insights or information asymmetries for other people. And I think this is really interesting at this current political moment that we're living in, when the fear of our government taking kind of an authoritarian turn is perhaps higher than it's ever been. And we're seeing, interesting new types of resistance actually emerge from within the tech sector, particularly with regard to who is the tech sector building for. So over the last year or so, we've seen a series of high-profile cases of major tech companies like Facebook, Google, IBM, Amazon, Microsoft, revealed that they've been working kind of deeply with different kinds of government law enforcement agencies, such as ICE, the NYPD, the Department of Defense, on things like facial recognition technology, predictive policing, and things like that. For example, the ACLU last year showed that Amazon had been leveraging its facial recognition software with law enforcement agencies from around the country, using their closed-circuit camera networks. And now the government is looking to develop their own mega databases to actually amplify that work. When the ACLU kind of came out with this expose, a number of Amazon employees sent around a petition with the hashtag #WeWon'tBuildIt, and they had 3 different demands for Amazon. One was a complete ban on the use of Amazon's facial recognition software for law enforcement purposes. Another was a ban on all contracts with Palantir, who's a major contractor with the Department of Defense and ICE and a number of other law enforcement agencies. And then the third was a demand for greater transparency and accountability around how the technology that these employees were building ultimately got used. Since then, there have been a number of other similar efforts from other major tech companies or the employees of these other major tech companies who are calling for greater accountability for how their tech gets used, particularly by government. And these efforts from within the tech sector are a part of a larger groundswell of political activity around the country. There are a number of local organizations who are really starting to push back against new forms of technology that drive surveillance and profiling of marginalized groups of people. And this is what I've been working on or kind of focusing over the last 2 years are these types of social movements. So probably the most prominent being Black Lives Matter, who have made really pointed critiques between the link of between mass surveillance and mass incarceration, but also more local organizations like Stop LAPD Spying Coalition or the Media Mobilizing Project. These are grassroots organizations who are at the local level trying to push back against the adoption of facial recognition software, predictive policing, risk assessments, and these types of things. But what I find really interesting about these groups is that they're not inherently against the use of technology. And in fact, what I find really inspiring is that these are often sites for new radical reimaginations about the way that we could use technology in high-stakes social domains like criminal justice work. So around the country, I've been really interested in these new types of grassroots efforts to develop, analyze, and deploy data in conversations about, say, criminal justice reform. And one thing I've been particularly interested in is something called court watching. So court watching is something that's happening now in many major hubs across the United States, in Boston, New York, Chicago, New Orleans, San Francisco. Basically what happens is this organization trains people to be able, just lay people like us, to go into a courtroom, observe the proceedings of the court, and actually take notes and collect data about what's going on. The types of things they might collect data on are things like, what is the bail amount that the prosecutor asked the judge to set for an individual who came before them? Or what was the decision a judge made about this certain kind of case? And why is that useful? So that's really useful because our courtrooms are places that we actually have very little insight into right now, and we have very little information about how things happen in them. And this is a moment when there's actually quite a bit of effort to reform the activities within our courts. For a variety of reasons. One issue I've been really interested in is this issue of bail reform. So across the country, over the last couple of years, there's been a really big push to try to decrease our jail populations. Our jail populations have quintupled in size over the last 15 years, and most of that is driven by the inability for people to be able to pay their bail before as they're awaiting their trial. So they end up staying in jail until their trial date, which can be months later. So there have been various attempts to try to get judges to stop using bail abusively. Things such as state Supreme Court orders, which mandate that judges inquire about a defendant's ability to pay before they set a bail amount, as well as like statutory guidelines that the legislatures have set out saying, hey, for these types of offenses, these types of defendants, don't even set bail. We don't even need them to have bail. So there's some really exciting efforts on the legislative front, judicial reforms. The thing is, we have no idea how those actually translate into changes in the courtroom, either because we don't collect data about the proceedings of the court, or that information is not made available to the public. So court watchers are trying to collect that information. And up here, I've got a couple of examples of this from Massachusetts, where currently CourtwatchMA is engaging in a 100 Days campaign to monitor the activities of our new DA in Suffolk County. So back in November, we elected a new district attorney, Rachel Rollins. A lot of people were excited about her election because she'd actually made some pretty specific promises on the campaign trail about things that she was going to do to support bail reform, support, limiting the detention and incarceration for like crimes of poverty, things like larceny and low-level theft. So over the last, wow, we're already in March. I guess the last 60 days, 60, 70 days, people have been going into the courtrooms and starting to track, okay, how are the employees of Rachel Rollins actually holding up those promises? And what's really interesting is we've gotten a pretty rapid data collection, data analysis, and data kind of messaging cycle going. So every week we've got new updates going on that are trying to connect this idea of data analysis to like public awareness down the line. I think this is really exciting for a couple of reasons. So like one, this is drastically expanding the set of people who are involved in technical things like data collection and data analysis. Most of the people who are engaged in this are not people who would call themselves data scientists or computer scientists. These are, civically minded citizens who are an integral part of this work, of both collecting and analyzing the data. And then also, the target consumer is the public. Really, the product here is really more knowledge about what our publicly elected officials are doing in office. And so, the goal of the work is really like civic at its core. So I think this is really an interesting kind of counterexample to some of the other work we're seeing generate protests. And I think, an exciting way to think about what it might mean to engage in technology in the future, particularly at this moment when technology has really captured the public imaginary around how we might address social issues. But there are no silver bullet solutions to these types of social problems. When it comes to a technological, if a technological solution seems too good to be true, it probably is. And if people on your team are trying to build something and they can't see the holes in it, it probably means your team isn't diverse enough. We need to increase the diversity of the people who are involved in building our technology. We need more engineers like Joy who can really engage in and dig in the weeds of these technologies and point out their blind spots. And we need more people like me who consider themselves historians or sociologists or activists and media makers who can really dig into and question the assumptions on which this technology is built. So I hope you will join us in this work moving forward. Thank you.
Chelsea, we've got time for questions, so I will facilitate, and we don't have a stick mic, so if you would just repeat the question.
Sure.
All right, all the way in the back.
Hi, my name is Alice, and I'm a sophomore, and I'm currently in computer science class. We literally just talked about how algorithm bias occurs, nowadays a really big issue. So I have a question that it seems to me that algorithm has inherently got the bias from its programmers and from the recruiters who has designed it. So it already has the bias issue, and we put a lot of time to design those. So why can't we just hire more women recruiters to or diversity recruiters to solve the problem? Why bother even design an algorithm who has the same problems, and it's a lot of time consuming stuff.
That's interesting. So I should summarize the question, which is, so it sounds like people are starting to study this issue of algorithmic bias, but why don't we, and that bias seems to come from the people who make these tools. So why don't we just diversify the people who make the tools or the people who generate the data on which the tools are based? Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. I think if you could put more diverse people in positions of power, that's another way these things could change. But that often technology seems more appealing because it's a way to get around those tougher changes. The trick being there, though, that we sell that technology is, somehow overcoming those biases on its own, which you've already pointed out is probably not the case because it inherits those biases. But I'd love that slower, more permanent solution of, having more women and people of color in decision-making positions. That would be another way to solve the problem. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Courtwatch. I've actually had the opportunity to work with MIT and been the beneficiary of some of the Office of Engineering outreach programs.
Cool.
Some of their projects, specifically MOSTEC or MOSTEC, however they pronounce it there now. You expressed some skepticism for some of these sort of outreach programs and exposure programs. But do you still see a place for them in these spaces as we move towards a more inclusive workspace, particularly in the tech industry?
Yes. The question is, I had expressed skepticism around some of these educational outreach type programs. What's the role of them? I think they're really important. I just think of them as an incomplete solution, right? Increasing the resources and opportunities available to people to learn interesting new skills is really, really great. But I think that must be paired with culture changes within these workplaces, so that A, they can recognize talent in new places, and B, they'll be able to hold on to the people that they bring in. I also did a number of interviews with people who were the only one in whatever team they were on, the only woman, the only person of color on their team, and the pressure put on somebody to be the only one like them in a room like that, even if everybody is nice, just the default cultural assumptions, it just puts a lot of, it's not a nice place to work. So I think pairing those types of efforts with other efforts that require majority people, people who feel comfortable in those environments to kind of reflect and also expand their way of being, that's a good way to pair those two things together. Yeah.
My name is Dinesh, and I'm a
Yeah, so I worked on some of that for a couple of years also. I was excited by like a lot of the ideas that were coming out of like this community of kind of cryptocurrency folks, particularly because I was seeing that these issues of like, aggregation of kind of activity on big sites like Facebook was really centralizing a lot of power and influence, which I think, became an issue in 2016 with the election and people realizing how influential Facebook was in shaping, civic discourse. I came away from that work pretty disillusioned, mostly just because I think that technically we could do a lot of things to decentralize the internet, decentralize the way organizations more generally work, but that even if it's technically feasible, it's not socially and politically feasible. Again, it requires a buy-in that often is not there. And then also, though, I think you also cannot internalize the complexity of the world into an algorithm that, says, if this happens, then we will do this. There are often, especially in like social, processes, a lot of externalities that you just can't foresee. And so many of these systems I saw for kind of decentralized governance ended up being pretty brittle and ended up having kind of behind the scenes political activity happening that then would get put into the algorithm post facto. So it seemed really tough to build a decentralized digital utopia on the blockchain. Yeah. And I'm happy to talk later about I think there are narrower applications of blockchain that are interesting. We can talk about that later. Yeah.
In addition to hiring algorithms, like could social media algorithms also be eventually problematic because of your own biases?
Yes, and I think they are already. Even so, have you guys seen much of the work that's happened discussing even like how YouTube like surfaces videos for people? A lot of the times, like Facebook and YouTube, they're optimizing for engagement. So they want you to stay on their site for as long as possible. The thing is, the type of content that tends to engage people for the longest is the most inflammatory. It's like the worst of the internet, It's going to be the stuff from way over here and the stuff from way over here. And so I was even just talking to my friend yesterday, and he was just saying, I don't know why I'm getting all these videos for Jordan Peterson stuff. I hate that guy. But like he's just getting all this like very inflammatory YouTube videos. So I think, those are unforeseen in the past side effects of trying to optimize for profit making, because those companies make money from ad sales and things like that. But I think it's already a really pressing issue that requires, looking beyond the bottom line of these companies to kind of think about, what role they play in curating our media ecosystem today. And then there's also all that other crazy stuff around how now people are gamifying these algorithms to manipulate what other people see. So even, leaving it open for kind of free speech to reign doesn't think about, all the different interested parties who might come into an ecosystem like that and then start to like play with how it works to surface their own content. So, yeah.
I was going to ask about tech's over-reliance on contract workers, temporary workers, and how that might be exacerbating these racial and gender biases.
It definitely does. I mean, there was a big walkout last year at Google, and it was particularly around, it was two big issues. One was all of the sexual harassment claims by C-suite executives that had been covered up, and then the other one was around kind of like the underpaying and under incorporation of temporary workers. Very much the Walmart model of keeping people under a certain number of hours so they didn't get benefits and things like that. And those do tend to be disproportionately like female jobs and things like that. And also jobs that I think there are a lot of really interesting ethical questions around just how do we handle doing the dirty work of the internet. So like folks who have to end up moderating content on Facebook and deciding whether or not something is appropriate on a news feed, which requires them to look at really violent or aggressive sexual content and decide whether or not it has to stay or go. Like the ethics of that kind of labor is really under-examined, I think, and very much under-remunerated at this point. So I think it's exciting to see kind of this organizing starting to happen within the tech sector. A lot of that right now is still the primarily full-time salaried employees, but they are starting to organize on behalf of people who have less political power in the system. So hopefully those groups will continue to merge down the line. I live part-time in Kenya. That's another really interesting place where you see warehouses of people working for big tech companies doing really tedious work that's completely it's not visible at all right now. So I think I'd be excited to see that conversation also kind of expand to more international labor markets and kind of the globalized tech scene and how that figures in the picture.
Right. Well, thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you, Sydney.
And before everybody departs, I'm going to remind you that we have panel discussions happening tomorrow and Hello 101. The first one is technology and social justice, so we will sort of continue the conversation that Chelsea started tonight. Making history. We're going to get the best career advice that our speakers have ever gotten. And then technology and storytelling. And so those start with a welcome breakfast at 9:30. The first panel is at 10, and we hope to see you all there tomorrow. So thanks so much for coming out.